Over to you, Chair.
Okay, welcome everybody to Corporate Scrutiny Panel today. We've got an interesting agenda. Any apologies?
I've not received any, thank you, Chair.
Okay. I'll just nip into the report for a second. I've just been in a school assembly, and it lasted a bit longer than I hoped. So I'm just getting my agenda up. Okay. Right, minutes of the previous meeting. Any issues arising from the minutes of the previous meeting? No? Okay, we'll move on. Any interests that councillors wish to declare? No? Next, ambition of the public. Yes, this meeting is all in public. Any deputations or petitions?
None received.
Any questions by members of the public?
Again, none received, no.
Okay. So, leaving the EU transition period, preparations update. Over to, is it David Bundy?
It's Jonathan, I think.
All right. Oh, okay.
Morning, Chair.
Morning.
I was actually expecting Naz Parker to join us, but I know that he's just been in another meeting, which may have moved very slightly. So I'll going, and he may be able to help me out on questions when we get there. So the paper that you've got in front of you today is just an update on our preparations for exiting the EU. So the last time we were at Corporate Scrutiny was on the 10th of September. The key issues in terms of national context at the moment are the ongoing situation in terms of negotiating a free trade agreement between the EU and the UK, the UK Internal Market Bill, which is shortly to return to the House of Commons, having had a couple of clauses removed in the House of Lords, and that the Minister of State for Regional Growth and Local Government has highlighted to local councils the issues around what they term a perfect storm. So that's the coincidence of a second peak in COVID, which we're now seeing, seasonal flu, impacts of adverse winter weather, and ending the transition period with what they term a non-negotiated outcome. In terms of regional preparations, that's stepping up a little bit as well. We've started fortnightly meetings of heads of economic development across Leeds City region, comparing plans and seeing what essentially each other are doing to be able to share lessons learned, etc. In terms of our own context, the tactical group is now meeting fortnightly to be able to look over the progress on the plan and review the risks that have been identified. ET and LMT are both receiving regular updates, and leading members were briefed last Monday, the 23rd of November. Streams at the moment are around business support communications, business survey, which is recently closed following up from business survey that was carried out in June to try and gauge the situation of businesses and their preparations for leaving the EU, the transition rather. Looking at the reliance in Kirklees on European Structural Investment Fund, ESIF, and planning for what comes after that. So the government has talked about development of a shared prosperity fund, but details on that are yet to come, though it's clear from what that over the last couple of weeks that that is still planned, but there are not details at the moment. Work is on EUSS support, and I intended to pull up the numbers that have recently come out. So what I do know off the top of my head is that we've gone from 72% of the 13,000 that were identified by the Home Office to 80% at the end of September. So that has increased, but not as much as we might have hoped if we hadn't been going through the pandemic at the same time. I've included in the paper responses around issues that were raised to corporate scrutiny on the 10th of September. Trade and services issues around EUSS for looked after children, business guidance, and stress testing of medication supplies for care homes. On the point for EUSS for looked after children, I'd just highlight that 4 of the 5 have now received settled or pre-settled status. The situation of the 5th is a little bit more complicated, but we're in the process of resolving those issues so that we can actually make the application for that child. In terms of the stress testing of care home medication supplies, we're continuing to work with the CCG to understand the situation there and receive the assurances that corporate scrutiny asked for when we were here last time. At the moment, we've not had a response and we're continuing to chase on that. I think those are the points I would highlight. So thank you very much. Over to you, Chair.
Okay, Jonathan. Has Maz joined us yet? I see here.
I'm here. Sorry, Chair, for being late. Delayed another meeting.
Yeah, so was I. Okay. So over to you, members. Any questions? Or is this just Brexit's coming? There's nothing we can do about it. Just make it stop, make it end. Is that it? No questions? Oh yes, Councillor Lawson. I can see your hands raised.
Thank you, Chair. I did indicate in the chat box, but it's always a difficult one to know which to do. Do we raise hands or do we indicate in the chat box? But both on this occasion. So yeah, just a couple of few questions. One is on the settled status support. In that item in this report, we sort of estimated 13,000. It said that actually Leeds and Wakefield have already exceeded Home Office estimates, and we'd probably just do to have a little bit of detail on how much and how many we're likely to expect and what that excess looks like. Sort of just kind of how far are we expecting to sort of see that rise. The other one that really is concerning me right now is the settled status for the looked after children. We have one outstanding, and I understand that officers are kind of all over that. I understand that they're very busy trying to do that as soon as possible. The fact that the child is in that position is unforgivable to my mind. That should never have happened. The question I'd ask, though, is that on page 14 of our report, it does say that there is a risk of some children being unidentified or misidentified as British on council systems. Now, if we look at our neighbours, do we have any idea of how many children there might be out in our system in looked after by ourselves who are misidentified? Because that to me is a very real risk. I understand that the settled status deadline is June 2021, but with an 8-week turnaround in these applications, I'm really very nervous about this, and I think we all should be. So I think I just asked that through you, Chair, about just those questions. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody want to respond to that?
If Jonathan is, and I can do, Chair. So we, as you've rightly said, Councillor Lawson, we are working very hard with Children's Services and those affected individual children to work through settled status, and have done quite a good job thus far for the ones that we have identified. I guess the difficulty is, and we're working with community groups in the voluntary sector to do that kind of, I don't like the phrase, but more difficult to reach people that we may not know of through kind of community contacts and through that kind of more trusted source. So the 13,000 that you've quite rightly said is a Home Office estimate, and other districts have already busted that number. We anticipate we will. It's really difficult to speculate by how much, but by quite a strong number. So I have heard an estimate of we might reach as many as 17,000 people. But that's, I think those are guesstimates and they're not based in real science as such. So, and it's just reflecting the experience of other districts in terms of how far they have gone over the estimate that the Home Office gave. On children in care, it then follows from that identification. And I think you're right to point out, which is why we've pointed out the risk, is that we can only identify those people who will come forward to seek support on settled status, and how we can identify all of those children is the work that Children's Services are now currently working on. I think we will try and identify as many as we can. The ones that fall through the net, Councillor Lawson, is something that it's difficult to know whether they have or they haven't until they pop up in the system, I guess. So it's right to be nervous, I think. We are equally as nervous.
Okay. Do you want to come back on that, Councillor Lawson, too?
Just to point out, Chair, that actually, we're dealing with some of the most vulnerable of the vulnerable in our borough, and if this is not sorted out now, it could affect the rest of these young people's lives. And we are working hard as an authority. I get that. It's just the fact that we've been put in this position to do almost an impossible task, and these unknowns are these are momentous for children's lives. These are life changing. If a child leaves care and is still unaware of their settled status, what position are they in? It's a very troubling scenario that we're in at the moment, and of course it should never have happened. I shall curtail my comment to that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Over to Councillor Homewood.
Thanks, Chair. Just one point on reading the report. I think it was interesting that the government minister is warning us that there might be a perfect storm, as if they didn't have any sort of control over whether there's a trade agreement, etc. is a bit strange, but never mind. Just in terms of the business support and communications, I understand that I'm just reading the bit about the communications to business, and I know that's coming from the Chamber of Commerce, but given that we don't have an agreed position on any sort of trade deal or not currently, I think it's talking about in November, talking about communications to business about the agreed trade position, and December sort of focusing on that preparedness, so there's a smooth transition in January. But I'm guessing that's not happening currently because we don't know the detail of that. So I just wondered what that means is meaning for businesses currently, what we expect the situation to be, and whether we're already seeing any impacts for lack of a deal. I mean, on social media, there's lots of people sharing things saying that, suppliers in the EU are saying to businesses that they can't necessarily honour orders and things that are made currently because they don't know what the position is going to be in January, and whether that there'll be tariffs or whether they'll be able to get goods to the UK and so on. I don't know are we actually seeing any problems in that space currently, or is that kind of I'm never quite sure how representative these sorts of things are. So I just wondered what the situation is on that business preparedness, and is there actually anything that businesses can really do currently?
Well, they find themselves in very uncertain times, don't they, as businesses? And to be fair, a number of businesses in Kirklees, because we have a high number of SMEs, did lack and still do lack preparedness. But preparing in an uncertain scenario is even more challenging for people. So we've been working with the Chamber and the Federation of Small Businesses quite closely in terms of that engagement with business. And the comms plan really at this stage has to be to signpost to government announcements or government positions, which is the best we can do at this stage, because there is no real clarity. And even when there is even if there is clarity, then that doesn't leave that much time to do the preparing for businesses and to then adapt and adjust to the new environment. And some businesses, the bigger ones, are playing out a number of scenarios in the same we have here, and done some planning on that basis. But ultimately, it's a question of when they have certainty and what they need to then do to adjust their business models to adapt to the new trading environment. So we will continue to work with the Chamber and the FSB to ensure we get out whatever comms we know we are able to give. Otherwise, it's a question of signposting, and the web page that we've designed, which Jonathan will have taken you through, is doing very much that at the moment. It's kind of links to government websites.
Okay. Somebody playing a tune. Right, Councillor Lawson.
Thank you, Chair. In the Kirklees context part of the report, we talk about COVID has kind of stress tested our processes and systems for our preparedness for Brexit. I know that we've done some on a regional basis before the first lockdown, before COVID hit. How would you describe the resilience of those systems? Have they been stress tested or have they been dented? I think that's my question, really.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand the question, Councillor Lawson. Is that
okay?
How has our business continuity system been tested? Is that what we're asking?
No, it's been tested by COVID. It says that in the report. So what I'm asking is, what shape is it in, and what is its resilience? How strong are they, do you feel?
That's a really good question, I have to confess, in the sense that we are currently testing that resilience just as we speak, quite honestly, because last week we spent as a leadership team and as senior management teams within the services looking at just that point in terms of should we now, because we're now having to deal with vaccination and mass testing as well as COVID response. We're now looking at the capacity needed to be able to respond in that way, not just in terms of the council's own resilience, but the resilience of our partners and other government agencies, stroke departments that may be brought to bear in terms of that response. So we have been severely tested through the COVID response, and we have been stretched. That was done on the basis of pretty much locking down every activity of the council services and training our efforts and our resources on responding to the pandemic. The learning we've taken from that into the next 3 to 6 months is to say we can't close everything. We have to keep some services going. So look at what we absolutely have to continue doing, which is the exercise we're currently in at the moment, and Sue and Joanne and Andy are working that plan through. In fact, I think they may be an executive team reporting back as we speak. I think what we think is that we've got the resilience as long as our partners and, say, for instance, the Army come to lend their support to that effort. Whether we can continue it through the next 3 to 6 months is a question we're just working through in terms of scenarios, depending on the various things that make up a perfect storm that we might have to contend with. So we're just doing a little bit of that scenario modelling to say everything's on vaccinations, for instance, and we had a flood to respond to. how would we cope? And at the moment, that business continuity piece has got the degree of resilience to give us the assurance. But that was before we were taking on mass testing as well. So we're just working through that.
Okay, so is it through you, Chair? Sorry, is it safe to say then that any negative aspects of Brexit will find us in an already weakened state?
I can't answer that question in as definitively as you would like me to. I think the work we're doing is to ensure that we're not in a weakened state.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Next, it's Philip Chalmers.
Hello, sorry about my late arrival. I'm having to do this on my phone at the moment due to email issue. The question I had, which may not be a large part of the local economy, but on the agricultural side, we have a few sheep farmers, and I wondered, that their plans are a year ahead. They've got lambing coming up early in the new year, and they don't know whether they've got a market to sell them to, with respect to the end of the transition period.
So that's a fair point.
Okay. Yeah. Fine. Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. It's just following up on what John's just been talking about resilience, really, Naz. And it's something we have talked about a couple of times in the leaders' meetings as well. And it's not so much about has the council got the resilience, but it's key individuals, and have we done that work to make sure that we've got almost like so what's the terminology? Your replacement in lined up if somebody is unavailable, because what we don't want is to have those single points of failure where there are key people that have certain knowledge or abilities or even authorities that if they're absent will create additional problems for us. So it's just another element of that continuity and resilience that my worry has been that we've been asking a lot of certainly a number of people across the council, and you could include in that some of the leadership of the council as well, and that can't go on forever. Expecting people to put in additional hours and work long days and work weekends. So it's just, is that continuity that we're doing, taking that into consideration as well, just for individuals, really?
Absolutely, it is, and it's something that we've identified quite early on, prior to this conversation and prior to moving into stricter restrictions. So around September time, as we came out of when we were back in recovery mode, we did identify that there are key individuals that have been working above and beyond for some time, and that their resilience needs to be thought through and their well-being needs to be thought through. So key individuals have been targeted to say you need a break, recognise that you might not want to because you own all of this, but we have been insisting on key individuals taking that break. We've taken and we did that particularly at half term, and we've planned through to Christmas at this point to say not only do those key individuals need a break, but the organisation needs a bit of a break. So we've just worked through what the rotas look like, both at a leadership level and further down, to ensure that one, we've got cover to ensure business continuity and anything we might need to do in terms of emergency response, and two, that not only key individuals but the organisations gets a little bit of a breather to rest, because we're clear that getting through to the end of the year is one thing, but then carrying on through the first quarter is going to be the challenge as well.
So thanks for that. We don't appear to have any further questions. The question I have is really, obviously, we leave the EU entirely as of 31st of December. What ongoing monitoring are we going to be doing to observe impacts? Are we planning to observe impacts for a period of time beyond? How long might that be?
Well, it will be ongoing. We haven't agreed what the time limit is, but and bizarrely, COVID has given us a rich source of intelligence and data flowing through from business now because of the work that the team are doing on business support in particular, and administering some of the government support that's coming through to businesses to take them through the pandemic and beyond into recovery. So. Yes, we will continue to monitor the impact on top lines and key sectors and the performance of key sectors in Kirklees. I would say for at the very least until the end of the calendar year 2021, we'd want to monitor to see what the first year impact looks like.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's have a quick look. Anybody else wishing to indicate on this item? No, so we will now go to the next item on the agenda, which is the Council's financial management update. So is that over to Eamon?
I think it might be James.
Morning,
Morning.
It's James Anderson, standing in for Eamon.
Right.
So it's I only found out he was struggling to get online, so I only found out 5 minutes ago. So please excuse my ring rustiness in presenting the item. I think I read it a couple of weeks ago. So how would you like me to present is probably the first question. Are you happy for me just to go through the report and the appendices?
Yes, please. That'd be great.
So yeah, it's a high-level council financial management update, incorporating the current financial position for 2021, including COVID impact, and then moves on to the council's MTFS for 21-22. So in terms of the quarterly reporting, we've got the figures as at Q2, which was a 5.5 million general fund overspend against a budget of 306 million, and that represents an improvement of 2.2 million from the Q1 forecast, which was 7.7. It includes a 3.7 million unfunded COVID-related pressures and 1.8 million of net pressures elsewhere, which is business as usual, as we term it. In terms of the COVID-related additional spend, that's forecast at 24.6 million, and the service income losses at 13 million. We're offsetting then government funding of 33.9 million, which is split between unring-fenced grant of 27.1 and an income compensation loss of scheme at 6.8. Appendix 1, I think, gives you a far more detailed picture on a line-by-line basis. The other thing to note is the forecast in-year DSG overspend, which is a high need pressure, is a 7.6 million, which the forecast overall DSG deficit anticipated to be 20 million by the end of the year, because it obviously includes last year's prior year balance that's been rolled forward. We are still waiting for some SIP for accounting guidance on that, which has been battered around at Corporate Governance and Audit Committee, just in terms of the way that balance has arisen and what will happen going forward. In terms of the collection fund, we have in-year financial position of 6.4 million pressure on council tax, which for context is about 3.4% against 190 million target income, and there's a 3.6 million pressure on business rates, which represents 7% of the 51.5 local share of income. The HRA is showing a small deficit of 1.6 million against 91 million turnover, which is equivalent to 1.7%. The capital plan has an expected outturn of 133 million against a revised budget of 134.9. And for comparison, the capital plan approved for 2021, when the budget was set in February 20, was 183 million. It probably then just the wider understanding that for the financial monitoring is subject to some degree of volatility. There are lots of, it's obviously it's a moving target, and there's lots of funding that's dropping in at various points. So the position will be subject to some change. But the intention is that we get as near to break even by year end, and we expect the executive team are working towards that. Probably just also to reflect that Q2 monitoring notes a number of other discrete COVID-related funding allocations in the year. So that just includes hardship fund of 5.5 million, adult social care infection control at almost 8.5 million, test and trace at 3 million, and the contain outbreak management fund at 3.5. All helpfully named very similar amount in similar names and varying amounts. So we have a fair job on collating them all. In terms of the business financial support, today the council has allocated in excess of 102 million of COVID business grants, which includes 5.2 million of discretionary grants across the borough to about 9,500 businesses. And we're currently rolling out further local restrictions grant support to businesses of 11 million. Government funding was allocated to support this to cover the current lockdown period to the 2nd of December, plus some backdated support to the 5th of August. The grant application process for these schemes went live on the 17th of November, so we're sort of progressing those as they come in. There's also a further 8.7 million funding allocation for additional discretionary support to businesses to the 31st of March 21. And at the time of the report, we're expecting cabinet approval for the scheme on 26th of November. Sorry, the scheme to go live on the 26th of November following cabinet approval, which will have been last week. In terms of the MTFS, the strategy update was approved at council on the 21st of October. And probably the main thing to reflect is that there's some degree of volatility in there, and it's best guess at the moment. Can you all still hear me?
Yep.
I'm not. Simon's joined online. I'll have to work out whether he wants to take over or not. I'll carry on going until he interjects.
I think just leave him there for questions, right? rather than disrupt your flow. I think you're.
It's just my painful flow. So yeah, I guess in terms of the MTFS, we set a planning framework, and we sort of abide by the following key principles. So that's a roll forward of existing multi-year plans. That's the starting point. We then they get informed and updated by the corporate plan, strategies and priorities, and we've extended the current 3-year revenue framework to 5 years, and we've reviewed the current 5-year capital plan framework, and that's an ongoing process that will lead into the main budget setting report. We've also updated the existing funding and spend assumptions, in particular in light of the medium-term COVID-19 impact on future year resourcing and spend forecasts. We've also utilised existing technical accounting flexibilities to allow the council to buy a bit of time. So this is almost saying we just want to get over this period of massive uncertainty. You probably know from the comprehensive spending review and stuff prior to that we're getting a 1-year settlement again, and the longer process may or may not happen next year, but hopefully it does, because there's a lot of pressure to give us a bit more certainty in our underlying funding position. There's also a roll forward of existing financial resilience reserves at 37.1 million, general fund balances of 10 million, and a demand risk reserve at 11.7. So all that is, I think, is done in more detail in the appendices. Again, just to reflect that we continue to work with Cabinet to bring the in-year revenue position back to break even as far as possible by year end. So then there's a bit of summary table of what was presented, budget strategy. So it's highlighting the budget gap, our estimated funding changes and the spending changes to give an updated gap before MRP flexibility. So that's the technical accounting adjustments that we referred to earlier. So yeah, that's really getting us to a proposed budget gap. And then we've made some assumptions about some adults funding to bring it back down to the expected budget gap. See it now. Obviously, this is a moving feast, and the spending review has happened in the meantime, and so we're working on updating these figures to reflect that, and they'll obviously drop into the budget when we sort of put, as we're beginning to put that report together now. So yeah, just to reflect, Appendix 2 includes a more detailed breakdown of funding and spend changes. So that's all the detail behind it. Other key assumptions are a council tax uplift at 1.99% in 21-22 and a 2% direct staff pay award and assumed national living wage uplift at 4.6% in 21-22. And probably those variables are some of the ones that have the flexibilities around those areas. Well, the council tax uplift is per spending review is capped at 1.99% with a referendum limit of 2% from the comprehensive spending review. But there's been some further things in terms of national living wage requirements on the back of that. We've also assumed a September CPI figure of 0.5%, which leads into the HRA social rent uplift, which is now maximised at 1.5% for 21-22. In terms of the business rate pool, applications were submitted to for us to join a leased city region pool for 21-22. That happened in October, and there is a little period after the spending review whereby we can it's after the provisional financial settlement, whereby we got a little period of grace. If we wanted to withdraw, we could do, but the whole pool would collapse at that point. Just a reflection that spending review was happening last week. Instead, the details of that will weave the way into the final budget proposal. So yeah, probably I guess it's perhaps, is that a good time to pause for questions? I think I've gone through a lot of the detail of the report, pouring through the appendices. Apologies for my ring rustiness.
No, it's okay. I'm sure Eamon will give you marks out of 10 later.
I'll expect my.
That's been fine. Been fine. Thank you. Okay. So over to members' questions. Councillor Taylor.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, James, both for stepping in and for what was actually pretty a comprehensive walk through of the report. This is a really difficult time, isn't it? Because everything is still moving, and to use what Eamon and I usually talk about, you're trying to nail jelly to a wall, aren't you, in terms of the numbers? I'm just wondering if it's possible to give us any headlines or gut feel or gut reaction to the spending review and what sort of shape of difference that's likely to make to these reports, because almost as you're writing up these reports, the numbers are changing, aren't they? So it's just an incredibly difficult time to really get any sense of certainty or stability at the moment. I just wonder if you could either yourself or Eamon comment on really the spending review, I guess, and what the headlines are from that and what our views are at the moment. Admittedly, understanding that there's still work to do on that. Thank you.
Shall we assume that Eamon is going to initially answer questions on this? Is that a good? Because give you a break, James.
See if Eamon's IT kicks in.
Oh, right. If Eamon isn't available, then please do step in, James.
Yes. I suppose the headline was 4-point-something% as for local government, but I suppose that the trick was in the detail. A huge proportion of that was the adult social care precept, and so it's not quite as straightforward, and it will lead to a decision on that will kind of be the telling point. The other stuff, there was some clarity around COVID funding dropping into next year. The sales fees and charges was also next year, so some clarity around that. But yeah, probably in terms of the numbers, a lot of that headline was sort of the headline increase was sort of inbuilt with the adult social care precept, which gave us, I believe, 3%, and it was spread over 2 years. So yeah, there was an option to weight it, however. And I'm not sure if Eamon's now available. It's flashing away on my screen, so I'll see if he wants to come in.
Just a request, can people who are not speaking go on to mute, please, because we're getting a bit of feedback.
Chair, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is it okay if I chip in on the spending review as well? Is that okay?
Of course it is.
All right, thank you. Firstly, apologise for being slightly late due to internet outages in the Queensbury area, being actively pursued. Thank you, James, for comprehensive review. I will give you a mark later, but it'll be a solid pass. So it was a good synopsis. Just on, I have managed to glean a few notes that I can read through in terms of headlines, in addition to what James has said. So, from the government's perspective, they've estimated that, based on their calculation, that the overall core spending power increase in 21-22 as a result of the review announcement is an increase of 4.5% average increase compared to 5.5% for the current year and 2.1% in 1920. So in terms of Councillor Taylor's ask, is it, in terms of a broad feel, in broad terms, it feels like actually there's a fairly reasonable uplift in funding when you compare it to the current year, which in itself was significant compared to the year before. And yeah, as James said, 2% city council tax threshold, and on the 3% adult social care precept, it can be flexed over 2 years, and that's been confirmed by Secretary of State Robert Jenrick. I suppose part of the issue of that, in terms of how individual authorities might potentially flex that, is because it's a 1-year settlement, and at face value, it might be useful to spread that in terms of spreading the impact of that on households in the Kirklees area, or even across councils nationally with adult social care responsibilities. But I think one of the issues is we don't know what the 22-3 settlement's going to be either, and whether or not government might go for another adult social care precept in 22-23. So, for example, if you went for if a council went for a 1% uplift this for 21-22, and then the balance of 2% the following year, there might be another adult social care precept then loaded on top for the new 22-23. So those are, I suppose those are some of the dilemmas of having to manage through a 1-year settlement. You're kind of second guessing what might happen in future years in terms of how you might approach that. It's probably worth noting as well that specifically on the social care funding uplift in 21-22, there was been a 300 million national funding allocation from grants. That compares with £1 billion equivalent in 2021. So government have put much more onus in terms of local tax raising powers in 21-22 to plug some of the gap with the 3% adult social care precept, whereas in the current year it was 2%. But I think overall in 2021 there was around about £1.5 billion worth of additional funding available. Whereas this year the equivalent is 1 billion for social care. What government have also done is, as James said as well, there's extra financial support for the wash-through impact of COVID into next year, because as you recall, the Budget Strategy Update report in October reflected in a number of areas that the virus doesn't shut down at the end of the financial year. It will carry on into 21-22. And government as well have said that the figures that were quoted for extra financial support to support the ongoing impacts of COVID on councils' financial bottom lines next year is largely predicated on a mass vaccination programme being rolled out by the end of the first quarter. So those effects will be relatively short-lived, but I think they've said that they will continue to review that. So again, taking James' point that while there's been a number of headline figures announced in the spending review, there is some degree of fluidity and review around some of these. So just on that COVID financial support, there's effectively 3 billion that's been given for the sector in 21-22, which is a significant amount of money. So I think of that, just over half of that will be a further tranche of general COVID funding for councils. So we've had 4 tranches today, which I think off the top of my head probably comes to about £34 million worth. This is effectively a new tranche 5, which will cover lingering effects of COVID on council finances through the early part of 21-22. We haven't seen the actual split of that 1.55 billion down to individual council levels, so I wouldn't necessarily want to second guess it, but it could be in the region of another 12 or 13 million pounds for us, but we won't know for sure until we get the detail of the provisional financial settlement, which is due 14th of December. So any headline figures I'm quoting at the moment are heavily caveated until we see the detail. Again, as James mentioned, the income compensation scheme, which runs through the current financial year, that's the government scheme recognising that there's been significant service income loss as a result of COVID impacts for councils across a whole raft of discretionary income. That scheme is also going to remain open for Q1 in 21-22, so that provides a bit of sort of risk contingency, again, against the lingering effects on service income for individuals. And there's also going to be additional help to councils because of the impact of the economic impact of COVID on employment rates in the area. So effectively, we're going to have more households who are going to be eligible for council tax reduction support. We're already seeing that, I think, through 2021. I think the current trends are that we've had an increase of certainly 3,000 today in year from original budget estimates. I think the number of council tax reduction claimants has increased from 23,000 to 26,000. And there's various national commentators estimating that the impact. I think the Office of Budget Responsibility said as part of the spending announcement that unemployment rates could be up to just under 8%. So there is an expectation that there'll be an increasing number of claimants in receipt of council tax reduction support washing through into next year. And that will obviously impact on our council tax base. So there's going to be some funding compensation to councils for that. again, devil's in the detail. It's about 670 million nationally, but we need to see what that means at an individual sort of council level. Other headlines. Government has confirmed that a range of existing grants that have been allocated this year, as I said earlier, the £1 billion worth of additional funding for adult social care in the current year, that will roll forward in council baseline budgets into 2021-22, as will the Better Care funding grants, which are sort of jointly managed between ourselves and CCG. The Troubled Families grant will continue into 21-22 as well. The national living wage uplift, James mentioned we'd assume 4.6% in the budget. Government's confirmed that that's now going to be 2.2%. So that's obviously got, again, a wash-through implication in terms of what it might mean in terms of what we may pay providers, particularly around social care next year. But then again, we also know that social care providers have their own pressures at the moment, and we've put significant extra COVID spend providers through 2021. We'll have that in around in terms of what might be a reasonable uplift for social care providers to ensure stability in what is quite a fragile market, particularly in residential and nursing sector, and is likely to be for some time. There's also an announcement of a public sector or partial public sector pay freeze, and I think government identified for up to 1.3 million public sector workers. Again, we'd assumed a 2% pay award in our budget assumptions for next year, in addition to the national living wage uplift assumption. But government has also said that employees that are paid less than 24,000 will get a minimum £250 increase, and that would include our staff as well. That would be our working assumption. So while the headlines may have commented on a pay freeze, probably the majority of public sector workers, because they're probably on lower wages and would be more eligible for the £250 minimum, will receive some pay rise in 2021-22. But as James said earlier, we need to work through, model through the implications of that, and then assess what the impact might be in terms of our overall bottom line assumptions. So there's quite a lot in there that we're working through at the moment. So what we'll be doing is effectively rebasing our baseline assumptions from the October report to effectively refresh to a new starting point at this point in the year, and then finalise budget proposals coming forward. So we haven't got a lot of time to turn that around, but we're pretty confident that we can do some headline calculations and then show them up once we get the deed of the provisional settlement. We commence in the 14th of December. Just to mention briefly as well, there were some other high-level announcements that might have raised a few eyebrows. There's a £4 billion levelling up fund that's bid-based, and there's 3 separate government departments involved in that. So there's quite a lot potentially of white-hall red tape involved in that one. So 600 million of that is available to bid for in 21-22. So it's not 4 billion to bid for in 1 year. It's going to be spread over a number of years. There's a fairly significant uplift in government funding to reduce rough sleeping and homelessness. So the existing grant funding has been increased by 68% on the current year, and there's a national pot there of 254 million. We'll get a share of that. And there's also a 1.7 billion capital pot for local roads maintenance and upgrades to tackle potholes. You can't have a spending review without some mention of potholes, and also to relieve congestion and boost connectivity. I'm not sure whether that's additional or whether it's just reaffirmation of something that had been announced from previous years over that funding allocation was always there. And just a reminder, I'll just mention one other thing briefly. It's that there was an announcement on the same day as the spending review around the Public Works Loan Board consultation outcome from government, which is important as well, because that's in relation to or to councils' treasury management policies and what it might cost to borrow direct from government going forward. So the outcome of that review was that there was an immediate 1% reduction in government long-term borrowing rates effective from the 26th of November. But there are some strings attached which will impact on some councils, but not all, and not us, I don't think. In that, following, again, you'll know from national press, etc., that there may be one or two councils that have stretched the stretch the parameters of what might be deemed too risky or not too risky in terms of certain commercial investments. All councils, because a number of councils have invested in commercial assets primarily for a yield, which then goes back into supporting services. And an increasing number of councils have been doing that, particularly through the austerity period, as an alternative means of generating income, which meant that they wouldn't necessarily have to reduce services or cut services as much through the austerity period. But undoubtedly, there's one or two outliers that have probably gone a bit too far, and government have effectively reined that in. So what they're basically saying is that for councils to be able to use a 1% reduction rate effectively, they need to their Section 151 officers need to sign off the totality of their plans, I think, on a rolling 3-year basis, and also sign off that there's no specific capital investments in there, primarily for commercial investment to generate a yield, because government's not going to allow PWLB borrowing for that purpose going forward. So councils would have to look elsewhere. So that's the caveat. They're basically government's trying to clamp down in terms of borrowing for commercial investment. There is an argument that it's trying to shut the door after the stable door after the horse has bolted somewhat on some of that, but that's where we're at. So that obviously would have an impact on us locally as well in terms of our treasury management policy, and looking at our treasury management budgets going forward, because I think in all likelihood borrowing rates are probably going to remain quite low. They're historically low for some time yet, but you can never say never in terms of when they might start nudging up. So mindful, I've been talking for probably quite a bit now, but there's quite a lot of detail in the spending review, and I barely scratched the surface. I'll just sign off the things that haven't yet been indicated by government that they might come back to, certainly in the early new year. So, for example, the extended business rates retail reliefs in 2021 that were awarded from the March budget in earlier this year. Government haven't indicated yet whether they're going to extend that into 21-22. I think they'll be keeping a close eye in terms of the vaccination programme. There's no mention yet if the weekly uplift on universal credit, the extra £20 per week, is going to be extended into 2021-22. And there's no indication yet if there's going to be any further COVID financial support beyond 2021-22. And we know as well that the fair funding review, potential redistribution of government funding across councils, that's been deferred, and there's no date yet when that might be brought back into play. And we know that the funding review of adult social care has also been deferred, and I think government have committed to having a look at that next year. But again, there's no timeline in terms of when that might be potentially introduced. And in the budget strategy update report in October, there was mention as well of the Institute for Fiscal Studies report, which was part of the LGA, Local Government Association, submission for the spending review, which reminded everybody that pre-COVID there was potentially a structural deficit in funding across the local government sector, and a medium case scenario was up to 5 billion structural deficit in the system by 24-25, I think, and that was largely a reflection of structural pressures around demographics, complexity of need, particularly around those demand management areas, and that certainly hasn't gone away either. So while the settlement at face value is welcome, and it certainly is in terms of some of the things that are in there, there are still issues to be resolved in terms of a sustainable longer term settlement for the sector from 22-23 onwards. I think the best way I would describe it is it helps plug some short term gaps, and it helps buy councils time. But that's probably where most in the sector are at with this spending review announcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Eamon, for going through all those items. Yeah, not a good time for councils that have invested in shopping centres as part of their commercial activity. I wonder how many councils did that. Okay, over to Councillor Lawson to start.
Thank you, Chair. Also, not a good time for anybody who's got money in airports, I think, at the moment. Thank you, Eamon, for going through that in such detail. That's a lot to take in, and I look forward to the narrative in the budget, because I'm sure it'll be very dense. My questions really are all about the business financial support schemes that we've been managing, administrating. So very straightforward. One, do we have an idea of how much it has cost this council to administrate those funds? Not just in terms of man hours, but in terms of the redeployment of staff and the jobs that they have not done in that space. So the kind of the recovery, if you like, of the jobs that haven't been taking place. I know that just on a very kind of just a very prosaic example is that some street scene work, some gardening work is being contracted out and things like that. So that those costs that are happening there, are those being accounted for? The other question I would ask is there any hint at the moment for what's remaining out of those pots of money, out of those grants? If there's any underspend in those, is there any indication that we can retain those to be able to spend on our COVID efforts, such as test and trace and that kind of thing? Thank you, Chair.
Okay, yeah. Chair, I'm happy to chip in for Councillor Lawson's questions. In terms of so the first question was about estimating what the knock-on effect or costs have been in terms of supporting the local administration of the various business grants. That's quite a difficult one to answer at this point. We will have a look at it, I think, in due course. I think it's obviously a good point to raise because, I mean, government itself has acknowledged that there would be extra costs. So they have distributed some new burdens monies for grant administration. And it's certainly, I think, with the first grants regime, the initial COVID business grants where we distributed, I think, just as James said earlier, 102 million to over 9,500 businesses in a fairly short space of time. I think we got an extra couple of 100,000, and the latest regime of business grants that's gone on live. Again, we'll get some additional new burdens money for that, and I don't think government have quite distributed that yet. I think they're still working through the allocation. It's fair to say that certainly within across welfare and exchequer and to some extent economy and skills services, there has been a significant reprioritisation and reallocation of staffing time to support the local administration. Within the timeframes available, there's absolutely no way that councils could suddenly go out to the market and get extra temporary resourcing and supporting, because fundamentally the way that those grant regimes worked and the criteria and the way they were set up and then monitored and reviewed required expertise and knowledge on the ground of our existing systems. So we've actually reprioritised and redeployed significant staff, certainly within welfare and exchequer service, and with the latest regime as well, we're bringing in extra support from accountancy, and audit have been involved throughout as well, and colleagues in economy and skills. And one of the issues there is that in doing that, because it was an absolute priority and the right thing to do, it's obviously generated a backlog in other areas in terms of household queries, changes of circumstances. Recovery action to some extent have been suspended anyway because the courts were shut down for a period. That's coming back in now. And clearly, in terms of ongoing support, particularly to households in greatest need or where they're having difficulty paying bills, that has created, I suppose, some sort of short-term issues in terms of being able to respond in a timely manner to some of those queries. But we're trying to get back on stream and catch up with those. Numerous staff within service have been working overtime. We've had staff working weekends, working 7 days a week, and these are staff that are also in some circumstances trying to juggle family responsibilities, kids, etc. So, I mean, I will say, I'll put it out there that the staff have been absolutely fantastic. Everybody who's been involved in this, because we fully appreciate that businesses need this money as quickly as possible, but we also have to put in place a reasonable number of checks and balances because it's using public funds, and again at government's insistence, and quite right. So we've had to do this at breakneck speed and are continuing to do this. So every regime of grants that comes forward, it has a knock-on effect in terms of how we prioritise the resources we've got available to support this, and that invariably means that some other services suffer as a result. And, you know, hopefully we're starting to come out the other side of this if we do get a vaccination programme, and that will relieve pressure on services to do all the other things that they need to do anyway, because these are critical services that support the organisation and support households in terms of income tax. That's what we're talking about. In terms of council tax and business rates, support income collection, and support in terms of recovery and supporting households, etc. And it's also drawing in accountancy time and audit time. And I think Martin Durnley, head of risk and assurance, has already articulated at Corporate Governance and Audit Committee some of the impacts of COVID on his service in terms of both home working, but also in terms of redirecting some resource to support some of these initiatives. I can't give you a pound note on it, I'm afraid, in terms of what the overall cost has been, but it's in terms of alternative uses of our existing capacity, it's been significant. So I think that was the first question. Sorry, Councillor Lawson, can you just repeat again the second question, because you had a second point as well, didn't you? It was to do with retaining any underspend from those grants. Ah, right, of course, yeah. Certainly from the original business grant scheme, when government allocated the funds out to councils, because they wanted to do it early based on high level estimates from various national returns, because at that point in time, going back to March, there were some liquidity issues in the market affecting every council sort of treasury management. Short-term liquidity was drying up in the market, so government was keen to get this funding out early because it was so significant. And I think our share was about 113 million. And I think as of going to press, we've used about 103 million of it. So that's not to say that we've kept money back deliberately. We've allocated according to the criteria set, and it's just a reflection of the fact, I think, that when government at the time allocated the funding, they had in mind what the split would be between the 25k grants awarded and the 10k grants awarded, because in terms of the number of businesses supported, their estimate is more or less bang on. It's just a split between the 10 and the 25k. I know that councils nationally have been lobbying into government about potentially redistributing or recycling some of those unspent resources back into the system. As it stands, councils are currently going through a reconciliation process with relevant government department, and unless they indicate otherwise, the intention is to repay those funds. But I know there's lobbying going on. I think LGA are lobbying as well to potentially redistribute those funds back into the system. I don't know what government might do with those funds, if they've got any plans to use them for other purposes. But I think across the system, there's probably second guessing here, there'd be a fair few 100 million that had been allocated that hasn't yet been hasn't been spent and is likely to go back to government. In terms of the current round, it's too early to say yet because we've only been going live for a week or so, and it's on a much smaller scale as well. So there'll be probably less wiggle room there. But we haven't yet got to we haven't finalised the current round of grants because that's ongoing, whereas the first round was closed. So it's a fairly significant amount. I know there's been some regional press on it as well in terms of what the impact of the underspends collectively across the region and what impact that could make if they were allowed to be redistributed back in. I think that discussion is ongoing between council leaders and relevant government department.
Good to know. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to James for stepping in at the last minute and Eamon for his fantastic description of where we think we are at the moment and all the detail that he's given us this morning. So I have very little to say. Thanks, Eamon. Well done. Just just a couple of observations that came out of the spending review last week is I am somewhat disappointed it was only 1 year settlement. We've talked earlier in this meeting about the effect of Brexit and COVID, obviously talked about now. It would have been nice to have it a couple of years so we could start to plan some sort of recovery. Clearly the economy is going to need a lot of support and help to recover, and the 1 year settlement doesn't help us have that bit longer strategic thinking. And I get why he did it. He's in the same position as us. Somebody's got a mic on it. He's trying to nail jelly to a wall, only his figures are much bigger than ours. So I just think it would have been a bit more helpful if we'd have had a slightly longer settlement. And the other disappointment that came out of the settlement is the fact that the 3% adult social care precept, which is spread over 2 years, clearly means that yet again we are waiting for some sort of decision or white paper or green paper from government on the future of adult social care. And I would have thought that the pandemic has shown that issue of adult social care needs addressing sooner rather than later, but it's been again kicked into the long grass, and I am a bit disappointed by that because it does need addressing. It's been proved it needs addressing. We've been talking about it now since Noah were a lad. It's just seemed, there was an opportunity to put some sort of ideas in place and start a process, but there's not even a process started on how we address what is a national issue. It's not just us, it's a national issue for everybody, and I am a bit disappointed by that. But other than that, thanks, Eamon. Very good. I've not a lot else to add. And thanks, James, as well.
It was a good summary of more than a summary, a lot of detail there about. So and your description, Councillor Turner, of being a bit disappointed. I think that's called classic British understatement, isn't it?
I was being polite.
Yeah, which is one of the few British characteristics that recognise the value of understatement. I'm not seeing any indications from members at the moment. Are we taking that as read? Okay, so thanks to both James and Eamon for your presentation of that, which was great. Quick on the agenda. Next item. Scrolling down the paper. Right, so it's the forward scrutiny panel paper, the forward programme. Not a good thing. So work programme 2021, 2020-21. Any comments on that before we move on? No?
I think Philip's got his hand up.
Philip. Sorry, looking at the paper and not looking at the thing. Yep, go on, Philip. I can't hear you, Philip. You're on mute. Classic error. Still on mute, Philip.
Still mute. Now you can hear me.
Yes.
Great. Sorry, I've had to do this on the phone, so I've not done it on the phone before. Yeah, it's just that it might be helpful to revisit the risk register towards the end of the municipal year again, in the light of the COVID developments or improvements and the impact of the end of the transition period.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It has been raised in earlier meetings, so there we go. So without any further ado, I think there's nothing else on the agenda at the moment. So unless anybody indicates otherwise, we can draw the meeting to a close. Okay. Oh, that's really. So yeah, thanks everybody today, and have a good rest of the day. It was quite a sunny day. I think I'll be out walking in the hills. Okay, see you folks. Bye.